in the paper, but you could see the smile in the way they talked to him about it after. It's like, ooh, darn. So that was the Eddie that he caught there, was just this, so they're saying hang your conscience on a peg, but what they know to be so horrific about what's happening there, their conscience won't let them let it go like that. Yeah.
I wonder if you could broaden things out for us some from this particular story, and explain, briefly the organization's involvement with the development of international human rights law. Let's just be arbitrary and say from '48 with the Declaration of Human Rights to say, take your pick, Algiers or Vietnam, and to what extent. I guess I'm interested in whether they were developing an expertise in international law in the same way they had developed an expertise in domestic law.
Well, I deal with a piece of that in Eyes Off the Prize, where what the NAACP had begun to understand domestically is that what was oppressing African Americans was not a civil rights violation. It was not simply the inability to vote. The being illegally searched and seized, not being able to have a jury of your peers. All of that's important. But what the NAACP understood, that what was taking black folks down was a human rights problem. The lack of education, the lack of housing, the lack of employment, the lack of health care. They're looking at statistic after statistic after statistic, and they're looking at this incredibly oppressive system. And they realize that the right to vote alone isn't going to be able to deal with it. And so they begin to argue for a human rights frame to deal with what is happening in the US. They're also arguing for a human rights frame, as I talked about, in terms of transforming colonies into nations. What the NAACP does, for instance, is they have their legal team working on the drafting of the UN Declaration of Human Rights and sending information back to the US delegation and the Human Rights Commission, Eleanor Roosevelt, who's a member of their board. And what they're arguing there is they're seeing that the declaration is just a declaration, it's not a treaty. It's not binding. And there are no enforcement mechanisms in it. That's a problem. Their staff, Marion Wynn Perry and Thurgood Marshall, clearly identify the lack of enforcement as a problem. So after the declaration, when the international system, the UN, moves on to begin to draft the Covenant on Human Rights, by this time part of what is happening is the Cold War. And so this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the US argues forcefully to break it in two and turn it into a covenant on political and civil rights over here, and a convention on economic and social and cultural rights over here, saying that economic and social and cultural rights, housing, education, health care, employment, that those aren't really rights at all anyway. And those are, and the language is the inarticulate Slavic desire for the economic well-being of the masses. It's a quote. Whew. Those aren't rights. Those are, at best, aspirations. Real rights are the Bill of Rights. And that's what the US is going to try to put forth as the real bill of human rights. Then Senator Bricker, in 1953, launches full force the thing on the Bricker Amendment, and all of that gets derailed. The NAACP also went to the UN in '47 with a petition outlining the systematic human rights violations that African Americans had faced since 1787. It was a powerful petition called An Appeal to the World. That thing got beat back and trampled in the Cold War, and Eleanor Roosevelt was a key member in seeing to it that thing did not see the light of day. So I saw the NAACP trying to be as engaged as possible with the development of human rights law. seeing that a component of human rights, a key element of human rights, is defined as communistic in the United States, because now, you know, we've got the second Red Scare going on, you've got the McCarthy hearings, dealing with the UN trying to, as they said, the UN is an underground railroad for communists. So linking, yeah, it's powerful, yeah, linking human rights with African Americans and communism in that kind of same way, underground railroad for communists. And that pressure pushed the NAACP off of its human rights agenda domestically. It continued to push for it internationally. Now, I went through almost every scrap of paper I could find in the NAACP papers, because I know what I think, but you know how it is as a historian. You just, if you could just find just that little scrap of paper where somebody made, just marginalia. Because what I was looking for, because what I think happened was, as they got pushed off domestically, that if you could create a human rights regime around the US, then that would put incredible pressure on the US, because then it's this kind of island of just not with it, right? And so this is what I think was happening, but I could never find the document. So I see them pressing forward even after this period where they're backing off domestically. They're continuing to press for it in terms of building, transforming colonies into nations, that you have to have a human rights platform in order to do it. So I see this language up until through the late 50s. Yeah, up through the late 50s.
Thanks.
Yeah.
You started by talking about Indonesia. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the NAACP view of the Bandung Conference.
That would be fabulous. Part of what happened, was that Walter White, who had been head of the NAACP since 1931, and he had been on staff of the NAACP since, I think, 1922, maybe, and the head since 1931. In March 1955, he's preparing to go to Bandung, he dies. And in March 1955, you're getting also the preparation of the Brown II, with all deliberate speed. And so the NAACP, and they're already under attack from the South. So they've got it that this is an important meeting. Roy Wilkins, who becomes the new executive secretary, he sends greetings, my brothers, peace, liberation, freedom, telegram, but they can't do much more, because they are, Walter White, who has been the head for 30 years, my math is bad, 34 years, has just died. But they knew that freedom was important. And so they sent the telegram, but they did not send the delegation. But prior to and Bob, your book was so helpful for this chapter. Thank you. When the Dutch began their police action in Indonesia in 47, the NAACP is all over it, and they are working with other organizations, and they are receiving information from the Republic of Indonesia that's